Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining another Matos Filho webinar. We continue on our series of webinars to discuss the impacts of COVID-19 on businesses in Brazil. And today we're going to talk about the changes in Brazilian tax law and the impact on businesses. The moderators for today's call are partner Amadeu Ribeiro, who manages the New York office, and partner Rodrigo Ferreira Figueiredo, who manages the London office. Answering questions today are partners Luiz Felipe Centeno Ferraz and partner Paulo Camargo Tedesco. We would like to recommend that you download the Zoom app for a better experience and to make it easier to ask questions. You should also know that you can send your questions through the chat box, and the speakers will do their best to answer as many questions as they can during the call. But the speakers will also follow up with any questions that are not answered live. So we do encourage you to ask questions. So we hope you enjoyed today's call, and now I transition the word to our partner Rodrigo Ferreira Figueiredo.
Thank you, Naya. Thank you, everyone, for attending this new webinar, an important webinar on the tax repercussions of this crisis in Brazil. The way we have organized today's presentation is we have Paulo and Luis Felipe. So Paulo is going to cover the changes we have been seeing, which have been enacted and which have been actually affecting businesses in Brazil as a result of this crisis. And Luis Felipe, in a second moment, we'll talk about the perspective, the changes that may take place, the impacts that this crisis is having on issues such as tax reform, which we have been discussing in Brazil for many years, and so on. So Paulo, starting with you, Brazil has a rather complex tax system. Brazilian subsidiaries of foreign groups are used to manage their tax departments very actively, even under normal circumstances. And now with the pandemic, the Brazilian government has been making several changes. Which tax measures have been adopted so far to reduce the impacts of the pandemic on the economy?
Hello, Rodrigo. Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk a little bit about the measures that the government has taken so far, and also about the alternatives that the companies have to face this delicate situation, this delicate economic crisis that we've been going through. So far, the federal government is working mostly with deferrals. Tax relief has been an exception. So we're postponing many of the duties, many of the obligations, discounts, reductions, exemptions. They are not common, at least so far. We can aggregate four main measures that were taken place by the federal government in these recent weeks as a way to react to the pandemic. So the first one is the deferral of some tax collections. Many tax collections, I would say, almost all tax collections, they are deferred. Second, we also have the deferral of the administrative procedural deadlines. So the administrative litigations and the administrative assessments, all the deadlines that the companies had to comply with, they are suspended so far and they will be resumed just months later. Third, the government also postponed some duties to compliance with ancillary tax obligations, those tax declarations in which we show to the government the amount of the taxes that the companies owe. And last, the government has deferred some of the tax burden, deferred some of the tax, and exceptionally relieved some of the taxes. So let's go a bit further into each of these measures that the government has taken so far. The first one regarding acts of collection, regarding the attempts of the government to levy the taxes. Well, the first, and I would say a very important measure in Brazil was the extension of the validity of the tax clearance certificates for 90 days. in order to get loans, in order to participate in public bids, and actually to have an economic freedom, I would say, the right to have the business in order and to get the economics of the business well. For many reasons, you need a clearance certificate from the federal government. So if you don't have this clearance certificate, it means that you are a debtor and you are in default, and this can restrict a lot of your economic activity. And the government granted to the companies that already had the tax clearance certificate enacted an extra 90 days, so they can have sometimes some outstanding debts. If they are new outstanding debts, these debts will not impact on the tax clearance certificate for this term. Second, government suspended the existing measures against taxpayers for defaults or for non-compliance with the obligation to pay taxes, especially the acts that are made by the Attorney General of the National Treasury. So bottom line, as a rule, companies should not be charged of any outstanding debts in this moment. Not until we are getting to a recover, not until we can change this economic and health scenario. And this suspension of the enforcements and of the collection, it also includes the suspension of withdrawals from easy payment regimes. So these tax settlements that are very common in Brazil, the possibility of paying taxes, installments, and with discounts. As a rule, if the taxpayer does not pay some of the amounts, monthly installments in a row, the taxpayer has to be excluded. And now the tax authorities, they granted a relief, they granted a deferral. They said that if we get in default in monthly installments, they will not exclude the taxpayer, they will not withdraw from these tax settlements. Well, the second measure that I just mentioned minutes ago, and also is very important, is the suspension of the administrative deadlines. So any tax assessments, any kind of administrative litigation, we are not obliged anymore to answer within the regular term, the ordinary term. These deadlines, they are suspended, which means that probably we won't have new tax assessments at the federal level for the further months. And also for companies that are litigating, probably these litigations under the administrative level, they will take longer to finish. Well, with regard to compliance with ancillary tax obligations, we had the postponing of 2 declarations until July. So the government allows and acknowledges that the companies, they don't have the ability today of complying with all the data, all the information that the government demands in order to calculate the taxes. Indeed, Brazil is very known for being a country that demands a lot of information, more than the usual to calculate the taxes. And the government knows that with the home offices and the home working, the companies are not as capable as presenting these declarations at this moment. So we had the deferral of 2 declarations, not all. It's very important to say some of the declarations are still kept, and we still have to follow the schedule, the regular schedule. But for 2 of them, which is DCTF and EFD, we have this postponing. Well, now in fourth measure, I believe it may be the main relevant one, the most relevant one for the companies. So I will take a bit more time to go over the highlights of what's going on. So the government also deferred some of the current taxes, okay? And the main taxes that the government deferred were the social contributions on revenue, which are PIS and COFINS, and the social contribution on payroll. And these contributions, the first one on revenue, it represents as a rule 9.25% of the revenues of the company. We can discount credits, but the nominal rate is 9.25% of all revenue. And the second one represents 20% of the payroll. So the amounts that would due this month and this month, April and May, they are going to be delayed until August and October. So this deferral, it's enacting for 2 months, April and May, and we will have the chance to pay it only in the second semester. And on the other hand, for small business, the government deferred almost all tax payments. So there's a big difference here on the treatment of small business and the most relevant business. The relevant business, they have few deferrals, and the small business, they had a much broader deferral here. Also, the government brought some reductions, some relief. So some taxes were exempted, of course, for this moment, for this specific months that we're facing, and some of them were reduced. So we reduced to zero the import tax rate for goods related to combat COVID-19. We also reduced to zero the tax on financial transaction for almost all of the financial transactions. So the loans, they are exempted from this tax, from the ones that were contracted between the beginning of April 3rd and July 3rd. And we had the reduction to half of the tax brackets of some social contributions that are owed to professional training systems and that also are charged on the payroll. So we have, as considering specifically the payroll, we have the deferral of the 20%, and we also have the reduction of some extra tax brackets that are put and they are carried to these professional training systems. And finally, I would say the government is encouraging new tax settlements and new payments installments in a good situation, not good discounts, but good installments, many months to pay the debts if it's the decision of the company. Last, and to end this first comment on of Rodrigo, it's important to say that the deferrals were partial and they did not include some relevant taxes. So we still owe regularly income tax, social contribution profit. If we add both, this means 34% of the company's profit, and all the contributions on payroll that are destined to social organizations. So not the 20%, but something around 5% of the payroll is still due regularly. And we also owe, as a rule, the tax on imported goods or services. And we also owe regularly the withholding of income tax, of revenue tax, and of payroll taxes. So the conclusion, bottom line is we had a very important relief. Of course, it helped substantially the businesses, but we still have a very relevant as well tax burden that was kept by the federal government, at least so far, Rodrigo.
And Paulo, are companies reaching out to you, to law firms in general, looking for strategies to reduce these impacts? So what can be done? What can we do to help?
Yeah, Rodrigo. Actually, this is being very common, and we've been very busy in many conversations and many works that were developing in this previous weeks because of this environment. So to answer a question, I would like to just to make some steps back and to understand the real effect of these government measures on the companies. So let's go over what companies are facing right now, what they're going through. The companies are indeed suffering, of course, not just in Brazil and all over the world. They're suffering a lot with the lockdown, and many of them in Brazil and as well as in the world, they practically lost all of their revenue. But meanwhile, their expenses were not eliminated. Actually, as a matter of fact, for some of the companies, especially the companies that render essential services, services that the population people need right now, they even had increase in their expenses, and that is related mainly to relevant spikes in prices, especially for health and hygiene products, health and hygiene goods for hospitals, for clinics, and for drugstores. We're dealing with new prices. Of course, not for everything, but for some products, especially the ones that are directly related to the combat of the pandemic. We saw a huge difference on the price. Of course, the demand is huge and the offer is very low. So this probably is happening all over the world and in Brazil as well. So the expenses, bottom line, the expenses for these essential services, they got higher. And also for all these services, it was necessary to offer to the employees, so for the workforce, individual protection. So of course, people cannot work in the way that they used to work few weeks ago. So of course, this meant a lot of new expenses. On the other hand, Rodrigo, we have to understand how economics are being dealt in Brazil in this current government. So the government, we have to understand how federal government sets economics and tax policies as a rule, as the way they understand the economy and they want to govern Brazil. So even before the crisis, the federal government has been driving the economic policy with a liberal approach, and it's important to explain some very important pillars of this approach so we can acknowledge what's going on and why the government first, yes, has already granted some very important measures and has been somehow they have understood what the companies need. This is a fact, but on the other hand, this may not be enough at this moment. Well, to understand how government thinks, first we have to know that the tax grants in Brazil, they were very common. So we have a tax system in which some pay high rates, but some others have exemptions, some others have tax reductions. And the government is saying regularly in the last years that they want everybody to pay a similar burden. And of course, exemptions, they will always exist, reductions, they will always exist, but we should have a similar tax burden. So the government is struggling against exemptions, is struggling against reductions as a rule, not at the COVID-19 environment, but this is how they act, this is how they think. And so, and also, Rodrigo, and less comment on this, the government is also struggling a lot to extinguish public sector deficit. So this means that, of course, if you don't collect taxes right now, if you don't get taxes, if the companies don't pay the taxes, of course, the government will increase the deficit and will not be able to present a balanced situation. So this is why the government is announcing the measures piecemeal, and I would say that this is a very important comment on this matter. So the government is going to see, analyze, and react little by little as they see that they need to do some extra effort. Of course, they are not saying that they're going to grant any extra effort, because if they say so, the companies will expect, and the pressure is going to be really big. But what we can expect is that the government is going to watch what's going on very closely and is going to grant new measures as soon as they understand that these new measures, they are relevant. So what this means, Rodrigo, this means that some companies, of course, the most affected ones with this economic and health crisis, they can't wait. So they some of them, they are in a very strong economic hardship, and the reliefs and the deferrals that were granted so far, they are not enough to avoid bankruptcy maybe, or a very significant crisis. So we're going to courts frequently this previous weeks. The lawsuits that are challenging the federal government, especially, but the state and the city governments, the municipal governments as well. All the governments are being challenged by the taxpayers at the judicial level to postpone and to defer all the tax debts until we get the exit of the state of emergency. So our pleading is to get plain deferral, not just the partial deferral that was granted by the government. And for you to take a picture, we're talking about thousands of lawsuits so far. So we've been following these lawsuits very closely, and we're reaching more around 2,000 lawsuits today. And we already have hundreds of decisions, hundreds of preliminary injunction orders granted by the judges, both at favorable or against the taxpayers. Nowadays, we have more negative than positive decisions, but we do have lots of positive decisions. We're talking about hundreds of positives and hundreds of negative decisions, Rodrigo.
And what would you say are the legal grounds to judicial lawsuits to reduce the
Yeah.
tax burden?
So the main reasons that we bring, they're related to force majeure. So the force majeure is brought by our civil code. So as a rule, it would not be a tax rule, but it also applies to taxes the same way because it's kind of a general principle. And as long as if we have a situation that the force majeure is implemented, then we should be exonerated of our obligations while we are in this situation. In our view, of course, you have to see business by business what's going on, but for many business, the current crisis we can qualify as unpredictable, inevitable, and that directly affected the business ability to pay taxes. The business, they are under, some of the business, they are under some very delicate and some very sensitive decisions, such as paying the taxes or paying the employees or the staff, or what I mean is that sometimes the companies don't have especially cash flow to face the situation and to pay regularly all the tax debts. And in our view, Rodrigo, there is no partial force majeure. That's the way we are arguing at the courts what's going on and how the measures of the federal government they should be seen, because the government grants the deferral. I wouldn't say grant. I just said grant, but I would pick another word. The government, it establishes, enacts the tax deferrals, but this is not granted. This is a consequence of force majeure, and at the force majeure, you have to be exonerated of all your obligations. There's no exoneration of some obligations, but some are kept the same. And we even have examples of the federal government in the past that they acted exactly the way taxpayers are pleading. What I mean is that in the beginning of the decade, and even this year, we had some regional state of calamities, mainly caused by rains, by floods, by environmental disasters. And then in these regional situations, federal government granted plain deferral to the companies, of course, to the companies affected, not for everyone. So what drives the federal government today is not applying the force majeure as it is, which would mean to defer all the taxes, but is to apply force majeure at the extent that, in their view, in their economic view, they are able today to support, to bear the economic consequences of not receiving so much taxes as they expected to.
Thank you, Paulo. Now, passing the word on to you, Amadeu, so that you can discuss with Felipe the prospective potential impacts of the changes that have been announced so far and are under discussion.
Thank you, Rodrigo. And good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. I'd like to now talk a little bit about tax reform, and I have a few questions for my partner, Luis Felipe Ferraz. We've been talking, Luis Felipe, about tax reform in Brazil now for a while now, especially under the new government. We were all under the expectation that we would finally get to a tax reform. How is that process impacted by the current situation? And are we going to have a tax reform? And if is it going to be modified in any way by virtue of the crisis that we're currently navigating?
Well, I guess this is the $1 million question at this point, because well, just for us to understand what will happen, let's step back a year and go back to 2019. Last year, we had the approval of the Social Security reform. The Social Security reform had or maintained the tax reform in a second stage or in the background. Let's say the bet for 2020 was then the tax reform, the discussion on tax reform. And why is it hard? It's a very delicate discussion because the Social Security reform was very complicated, but it was a federal discussion. At this point, a tax reform, as we call the constitutional tax reform, it tried to impose a creation of a VAT, a federal VAT, in replacement for taxes that are currently charged by states and cities in Brazil. So we have a VAT, a state VAT tax. We have what we call the ISS tax, which is a service tax that is charged by the cities in Brazil. And we have more than 5,000 cities in Brazil, so it's a huge discussion. And we had also some federal taxes that would be unified at all in a single tax. That's what we call the constitutional tax reform. The idea was for the government to discuss this year. I don't know if I say that in the past or in the present, but the idea is for the government to discuss this year, the combination of all these taxes in one single federal taxes. We had 3 bills at this point. We had 3 bills under discussion in the government, one by the House of Representatives, one by the Senate, one by the government itself. So the idea would be to unify them all, to create one single VAT, to have a discussion with the states, discussion with all the cities, or at least a representation of the cities this year, and have the reform approved this year. And why am I saying at this point that in the past? Because I don't know if I should say that in the past, because this is an election year, which means that in general, from a political perspective, we know that second semester is very much focused on discussion of politics, elections. So I would say that the government will be in a rush, or tending to be in a rush, to discuss everything, or to have everything very much speeded up to June or July. So that will be, let's say, the agenda. And of course, there will be a delicate agenda, as I said, because you have many discussions of complex issues. When the COVID-19 came into action, let's say, we have the government very much focused on unpredicted things. There is no formal position of the government as to postponement of the constitutional tax reform. There is no position as to that. So I understand that, formally speaking, they may have that on the front, but I understand that that might be something that could be complicated at this point because we need cash, we have some other urgencies. So I would say that there is a good chance that the tax reform is not approved this year. And if it's not approved this year, we have next year. Next year in principle, will be a better year for discussion. The thing is, it's very likely that Brazil will be in a recession next year or live in a recession next year. So a discussion on a rearrangement of taxes will again be complicated. So it will be very much dependent on the government to use good policy to discuss that with states and cities. If that doesn't happen next year, I would say 2022 wouldn't be a year because, again, that's a presidential election year. So that will be very much hard for us to have a final government discussing this. That's the constitutional tax reform. We call the other part of the reform, which is the infra-constitutional reform, which is an amendment to corporate taxes and transfer pricing. That is very much dependent on the government itself, the federal government itself. So it's better for the government to have them approved, regardless of a discussion with the states. So it might be something that the government might be willing to do with respect to this year. Corporate taxes, maybe transfer pricing.
Thank you, Luis Felipe. And how about dividends? There have been talks about taxation of dividends. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, this is another discussion that has been forever around, because dividends, they have been exempted from withholding taxes and from any type of taxation. They have been exempted since 1996. It's been more than 30 years. So it means that we have been enjoying that exemption for a while. Let's say from 2018 onwards, with the presidential election, we had the discussion that was a matter that was brought to the table again, and by other kinds. So it means that it's a stronger discussion. It's a stronger rule. It's a stronger effort of the government to tax them. The thing is, again, it's controversial, because the idea by then in 1996 was to attract investments, and by then the government started burdening the companies themselves, meaning that they raised the overall corporate tax basis, corporate tax rates. So it means that a review of the taxation of dividends would depend on a review of the corporate tax basis. That's my view, at least. It's a view of the government itself. We have around 30 projects in the government, in the Congress, discussing the taxation of dividends, and I would say that none of them, or at least almost none of them, discuss a review of the corporate tax burden. So that's again, that's something that should be taken that should be seen very much carefully. And what is the problem of a COVID-19 discussion at this point is that a rush in a creation of a new cash for the government could focus on taxation of dividends, a rush again in the creation of new rules. So I might say that some Congress people, they might be tempted to increase the tax of or liquidate exemption of the taxation of dividends and not review the corporate tax basis. We can see that here the government faces a huge problem, or a huge struggles with a discussion. No taxes can be charged in the very same year in which they are created. So it means that if we create a taxation on dividends in 2020, they can only be charged as of 2021. So if the government really needs immediate cash, it will really need to go into another discussion, but not the taxation of dividends. The taxation of dividends is for next year. What we had, let's say, two weeks ago, was the creation, the filing of a new bill that was removed anyway, but it was an attempt by the Congress to create a taxation of dividends for 2020. So it would be retroactive to January, and it would burden all individuals. Of course, the economic environment went crazy about that, and this bill was removed from review by the Congress. That means that it won't, again, at this point, we don't have any bill in force, or at least running or under review for the taxation of dividends. But I would say that this is something that might be on the table, and it's something that is easier to implement than the constitutional tax reform and any other reform, because it's sympathetic to the society in general, and it's easy for the government to create a law and put it into review by the Congress. So taxation of dividends might be something for next year, but again, we're keeping an eye on that.
Yeah, so we see that government is talking about increasing taxes in general as a means to cope with the current crisis. Do you really think that that is the route that the government is taking? So taxation of dividends might be a way. Would there be other ways to achieve that same result that could really become implemented?
I would say that taxation of dividends is the one that has that flavor of social, at least I understand that's what people say, that has the flavor of social justice. So this is why, even though I disagree with most of the arguments, that's the flavor. So I would say that's something that might be easier for the government to make it pass. Another attempt of the government is the wealth tax and the creation of a wealth tax. A wealth tax is designed, is described in the Constitution, the Brazilian Constitution, but has never been implemented. It's been there for 30 years and it has never been implemented. And we have had in the past some discussions on creating this. But at this point, with the crisis and again, the need of the government to create a cash, we had a couple of bills under review by the Congress creating a wealth tax. And I would say that the one that could be more advanced in that respect would be a bill that would create a wealth tax to some level of taxpayers, and I would say there will be individuals with let's say a wealth higher than $5 million, and they would tax this wealth on rates between 0.5 to 1% on the assets, and with some deduction, of course. But that's something that would be under review by the government. Again, it's not the only one. We have, I would say, 4 to 6 under review at this point, but this is the one that will be more advanced. Again, we have a problem here, and a problem with saying for to come, because for the government, any wealth tax that could be created can only be charged as of next year, not for this year. So again, if you need immediate cash, that's not the way to go for the governments. That's why I see that some wealth tax bills, they have been discussed along what we call the mandatory loan. They have described the mandatory loan as an immediate charge. And what is the mandatory loan, which is, I guess, was in the last slide. The mandatory loan is a tax also in Brazil. It has been implemented in the past, and it means that the government may charge in case of in a crisis like this, in pandemic cases, they can create a loan that could be charged immediately, and then should be returned in a couple of years. Of course, with a monetary correction and interest. It's a loan, so the government should be returning this amount. So the great advantage is that they would be able to create something that would generate cash now, and the disadvantage would be the need of returning this cash in the following year. So what I see is some wealth tax bills, they have been drawn with along with a compulsory or mandatory loan, meaning that the government would generate cash in 2020 with a mandatory loan, and as of 2021 they would generate cash with a wealth tax. So that's the way I see it. If I have to say, wealth tax is something that is not very sympathetic by to many people in Brazil, so I have doubts about that. It comes very often, not very often, but sometimes it comes into discussion, but I don't see that being approved, at least on a short term. And I don't know if I'll be mistaken, but let's see. We're keeping an eye on that also.
Thank you. So we've been talking about legislative proposals and what to expect in terms of new taxes, but let's talk a little bit about what's actually happening in tax enforcement and how the revenue services are operating in Brazil. And do we see any changes as a result of COVID-19 in terms of how the revenue services are behaving throughout the country, not just at federal level, but also state level?
Yes, they have issued, let's say, it's not a proposal, but a letter of intent or a letter of suggestions, reinforcing the need of charging dividends, reinforcing the need of charging the compulsory loan. They have been reinforcing the need of creating a wealth tax, but they have the letter, it provides some other discussions and some other suggestions here. For instance, they say that payroll exemption should be provided by the government. They suggest the creation of a, let's say, an additional tax of 15% on corporate tax of 15% and 4% on a revenue tax for financial institutions. They have been suggesting the idea of creating a temporary tax of 10% on the export exchange contracts with a certain threshold. So they're suggesting the increase of to 30% of the real estate and donation tax. So there is a list of things that they think should be implemented to generate cash. In their view, they say that all these suggestions, they would generate to the government something around 40 to $50 billion. So it's in theory, it's huge revenue, and I understand that the government might appreciate some of this, but I don't see that really going forward at this point because we have many suggestions, and to pass all of these suggestions is something, it'll be groundbreaking. So I'd say that at this point, the government would stick with the review of the compulsory loan, with the dividend discussion, with the wealth tax. I would say that for now, and of course the tax reform. So I would say that for now, this is something that would be more feasible to discuss. And I guess this is for 2020. So if we have to go to 2021, we can have a huge level of other further discussions. Of course, we're discussing things that could be more immediate at this point.
Thank you, Felipe. I think with that, we finished this first set, directing to you and Paulo. Now we move to a Q&A session. We have many questions coming from the audience. Attendees may, by the way, may ask questions using chat on your screen. We have been getting many questions. I am not sure we'll have time to answer all of them, but any questions we are not able to answer on this video conference call will be answered later by email. And so Paulo and Felipe, I'm taking turns between the two of you, depending on the nature of the question asked. So moving to the first question we got from the audience, is the IOF 0% rate, does it apply over intercompany loans, floor plans, and any other financial transactions with no determined amounts? And if yes, does it include the open balance on April the 2nd and new money transfers?
Yeah, the issue with the IOF loan, just to give everybody a context, IOF loan is a loan that is provided on many taxable events, and one of them is credit. So as you give loans in Brazil or get loans, there is IOF that is levied on specific rates. The government said that all the contracts closed, loan contracts closed between starting April and starting in June, in 3 months, they will be exempt of IOF tax. And the discussion here is that there is not a technical word for this. The government said all the transactions contracted in this period. The thing is, if a transaction is contracted before this period, in theory, it's not protected by this exemption. If it's contracted after this period, naturally, it's not protected. If it's contracted within this period, you have the protection, even though the contract is higher than 3 months. The problem here is that when you have a floor plan or you have any type of credit that is open with no principal amount, the discussion, and this is something that the government hasn't clarified at this point, is whether or not it will be contracted before, or if it's any amount that you withdraw in that 3-month period will be considered contracted at that point. I guess there are good arguments to say that it is contracted at that point, at least that amount, if you don't have an amount that is described in the agreement. So I would say that we have more, we could have arguments in this respect, but of course we have to review the agreement itself and see what are the terms of the agreement.
Thank you, Felipe. Still on IOF, I'll try to group questions around the same subjects. So we have another question on IOF. What will be the extent of the IOF zero rate benefit after July 2020?
Yeah, I would say the zero rate will be extended to transactions after that. Let's say that we have an agreement, a contract that we are now on the 14th. We signed this agreement at this point, so release the cash. There is no IOF here because it's exempted, and we have the agreement is for 3-4 years. It's still exempt because we are releasing the cash at this period in which the exemption applies. If we have an agreement in which we don't say what is the principal amount, and then we have some release of the cash, let's say in a year, even though the contract was signed here, there are good grounds for the government to charge that amount in a year or two because it was released out of the period. But so the discussion here is whether or not we have a principal amount described in the agreement, or if it's just a credit that we are granting that could be taken in the future.
Thank you. Now we have a couple of questions on states and municipalities. So what have states and municipalities done to benefit taxpayers during this crisis so far? One of the attendees says, so far no postponements in Rio de Janeiro, for instance, in spite of a public calamity decrees.
Yeah, we have seen that it has been very unequal. So it's easy to talk about the government, the federal government, but it's hard to talk about 26 states and one federal district because they have different taxes and they have different views on that, and they move very differently. Some of them speedy, some of them they take a while. We see some of them they have given a deferral, some of them they haven't. So it's very hard to deal with the government, with the state governments in that respect. And and municipalities even worse because we're talking about 5,000 cities. So for instance, we have Rio, state of Rio has exempted alcohol gel, as far as I understand, but it hasn't exempted the masks, for instance. So we have very unequal trends and very unequal movements by states and municipalities. It's really harder to talk about them because of that.
And back to compulsory loans, this seems pretty harsh. So there's a question here. Can you explain again compulsory loans? And there's a question specifically about the time for repaying the loan. Why does the need to pay in the following year? Could it take 20 years, for instance? And how would you define the interest rate? Could be something like TR or some other official rate.
I don't know, Paulo, do you want to say something on that? Or?
Okay, I can take this one, Felipe. So I would say that this is a pure matter of tax policy and how the government will react under the circumstances that we're facing. So they can either announce or compromise with the reimbursement within a few months or even the following year, or they can give back the money for the companies and the taxpayers in a larger horizon, such as some years. When we talk about the bill that is mostly discussed today, so I would say that this is the one that we should focus as being the one that has some possibility of being approved. We're talking about the restitution or the reimbursement of the amounts within 4 years after the end of the state of calamity. So the government decided, and it's up to them to make this schedule and to give back the money installments and within this term. And about the interest or how the money is going to be calculated for the reimbursement, we can bet on Selic. Probably we will have Selic because today at the federal level, federal taxes in Brazil, we use Selic as a rule since 1996. So we can expect that they are going to grant the money back with Selic. TR, as question, is being less and less used. As a matter of fact, the Supreme Court has even considered that TR is not a monetary correction index. It's another kind of index, and the TR could not be used for many purposes, such as for the government to pay back the amounts that they were convicted in justice, which are the precatórios in Brazil. So even though maybe an attempt to use some other kind of correction that would not be Selic, what we can expect from our National Congress, which is being very present and very positive in bills in Brazil, is the use of Selic. That would be the most expected in our view.
Thank you, Paulo. And I have another question for you. This is very interesting. To file lawsuits to postpone payments, how do you go about, we talked about force majeure, right? The argument, the grounds would be, there has been a force majeure event, and so the company is no longer able to meet these payments, so it needs to postpone them. So in that kind of lawsuit, what kind of evidence would the company have to produce? Would the company need to show the court that it doesn't have the cash to meet the payment? How does a company go about doing that?
Well, Rodrigo, the best scenario for certain would be to show to the judge what are the real and severe consequences and relevant consequences of the economic and health crisis to the business. So what we suggest as a rule is that the company brings to us all the economics that may bring grounds for our arguments, which means showing how the revenue was affected. If we indeed have a rapid decrease on the revenue, showing the amount of the payroll, which is some fixed cost, a cost that it doesn't vary as a rule in this moment, and how much the company pays usually in taxes in Brazil, not just at the federal level, but also at the state and at the municipal level. So we can bring to the court the reasons that show that the company is not able today to bear with the whole tax burden, or at least with the tax burden that was still kept after the deferrals. And it's important as well to show the consequences for the cash flow, because when we talk about the deferrals and the situation that is going to be shown to the judge and the claims that we're going to present, this is much more a matter of cash flow than a matter of profit, or it's important to show to the judge that in this specific moment the company might not have enough money to pay and to meet all their obligations. This doesn't mean that the other companies, the companies that were not affected in a very relevant way, could not have a similar claim. Indeed, they can follow the same deferral at the judicial level, and some of the judges, they will grant the same deferral, and this many times this is based on the way our revenue service acted on the previous situations, on previous regional situations that we were talking about a few minutes ago. What I mean is that when the revenue service granted in the beginning of the decade and in the beginning of this year some deferrals, some regional deferrals for cities, for companies that were based in cities with floods and rains and calamities, then the deferral was plain, was full. It was not partial. So we have this former example and this formal acts from the Federal Revenue Service that can be a good base for the claim. So as a conclusion, Rodrigo, I would say that the lawsuit is definitely better for the ones that can show the consequences, the true consequences of the crisis, but it's still possible with less chances of success for the ones that were not so impacted.
Right, and somewhat related to that, do you see companies pleading lawsuits other kinds of tax relief besides deferral? So reduction of taxes, for instance.
Yeah, this is happening a lot. What we see today at the judicial courts, first, we also have a very strong movement that is going on with many companies, dozens, I would say hundreds of companies, pleading to withdraw escrow amounts that were deposited into courts to guarantee the payment of the tax debts if they lose the lawsuits. So we have a trend today that once the companies need the cash flow, this money that is kept under the justice, it should be given back to the taxpayer. So the taxpayer, the plaintiff of the lawsuit, could today make better use of this money because the companies will need the money. This is not an easy claim, and we can say that the possibilities of having a negative decision, they are bigger than to achieve what we are looking for. So just a few cases, we will have the authorization to withdraw the deposits. But even though it's a good moment to plead for this, a few months ago it would be barely impossible. Today it's a hard claim to bring to the judge. Besides that, today this scenario that we're facing today is also a good moment to think about some other judicial measures that can bring savings to the company and avoid some taxation today, because we won't get, at least so far, the amount of the deferral that some companies may need. So this might be a good opportunity to revisit the alternatives that are very common in Brazil, to go to the judicial level and to plead to the judge to avoid some of the taxes. And then we have dozens of alternatives, dozens of situations that could be studied by the companies to see the ones that have more odds of success and the ones that would indeed help at this time. I believe we won't have time to discuss one by one, but it's important to revisit and to see if the company went through most of them. Some of them, they might be able to obtain an injunction order of the judge to suspend the enforceability of some taxes, which would mean an immediate relief on the cash flow.
Thank you, Paulo. Well, I guess because of the time, I think this takes us to the end of this webinar. We still have questions we have been not able to answer on the call, but we'll answer them, as I said, in writing afterwards. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending. Thank you, Paulo and Felipe, for answering all these questions and clarifying all these matters to us and our attendees. Just to remind everyone, we have one last webinar in this series on Thursday, same time, on the regulatory and labor and employment impacts of this crisis in Brazil. So see you there, and thank you very much for attending our webinar today.
Thank you.
Thank you.